Okay, so in my last video, I talked about the suspension ratio, and I really didn't explain it. I didn't have enough time. So I just wanted to quickly do this little video to talk about how the wheel can move one distance and the shock compresses a different distance. So here we have our Kmart Kawasaki, and if you look, right now the shock measures about 6 inches. Okay? I have this ruler set up with the center line of the axle. Okay? Now if you were to, this is how you figure out the ratio. If you go between the pivot point, it's about 18 3/4. And then if you go from pivot point to this pivot point, it's 8 3/4. So I did the math up here. It was 18.5 overall from the pivot to the axle and 8 3/4 to the shock mount. If you divide this into that, you come up with 2.12. It's about 2 1/8. So we should get, if we move the rear axle, the rear wheel 2 1/8 inch, we should get 1 inch of travel at the shock. So let's do that. So if you look here, I got this mark to the axle center line. And my mark up here, that's 2 1/8. So if we go back to the shock here, you see now we have 5 inch. So the rear wheel moved 2 1/8 inch, but the shock only moved 1 inch. Okay? Now I'm going to change the swing arm and show you how it can be different, even though it's the same type of setup. Okay, so this swing arm is off another box store bike, another similar frame. But the difference is, it still has 18.5 inch to the pivot, but from the pivot to the shock mount is only 7 1/4 inch. Okay? So you notice, so I have this mark at 2.5 at the axle. So let's move the axle 2.5 inches. And you'll see we're back at about 5, okay? So that's because with the shorter distance here, it moved the shock less distance. And if you look at the math up here, 18.5 inch, same axle length. So both of these swing arms are the same from pivot to axle. But from the suspension pivot to the shock pivot is 7 1/4 inch as compared to 8 3/4. And that gives you a 2.55 to 1 ratio. Okay? So that's why when the other video, I said with this swing arm, we would have 80 millimeters of travel with that shock. Our air shock has 38 millimeters of travel at the shock. But because of the ratio, we're going to get 80 millimeters at the wheel. Okay? Now with this suspension, we would have 97 millimeters at the wheel. Now this is common with a lot of box store bikes. Some of them you'll see the lever type suspensions, and you also see levers on all the higher end bikes. And that's not just to get more travel. With a lever, you can also have a rising or falling rate, which means the travel won't be linear. So any of these bikes, I mean the shock angle affects it somewhat, but you're going to have a linear compression of the shock. So as it goes through the travel, the speed at which you're compressing the shock doesn't change. It matches the speed in which the axle is moving. So this is a bit simplistic, but I just wanted to bring some out about what I was talking about when I said my 38 millimeter travel shock would have 80 millimeters of travel at the axle. So I hope this clears things up a little bit.